In this video, multidisciplinary artist Jennifer Weigel offers some pointers and shares her experiences from over 10 years of exhibiting nationally, both in grassroots organizations and larger-scale institutions. This presentation is designed to help artists of all levels working in all media gain confidence and better present themselves and their artwork in writing and when submitting to shows and galleries, both locally and nationally. The informal lecture format touches on themes of how to price your artwork, entering shows, and professional presentation. Learn more about Jennifer Weigel at jenniferweigelcoaching.com.
And then all of the forms that I brought are going to be on the website too if you want to download them or pass them on to somebody else. I want to start with the idea of considering value and how we price our artworks. There's a number of factors that come into play when determining the value of one's art, and one of the most difficult challenges we face as artists. A lot of people have a lot of confusion about this. They ask a lot of other artists for clarification and to try to figure out what they should price their works at. And a lot of newly exhibiting artists who haven't considered this often find themselves in situations where they have to come up with a price on the spot. Somebody looked at something that they've done, and they really liked it. They said, oh, how much is that? And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I don't know. So it's worth consideration. Production and exhibitions costs. Questions to consider: how long does your art take to produce? How much does your art cost to produce? How expensive are the supplies used? How readily available are your materials? And how easily can you produce similar works in that vein if you want? What is your level of skill and mastery? How much time and work have you put into honing your abilities? How rare is your trade? How much training do you have, and how common, expensive, or involved is that training? Because if you're doing something that nobody else is doing, then your work's going to be valued in a different way than if everybody's doing it. You know, and some things are just more common than others, and some things take a whole lot of mastery to be able to hone that ability, and that's worth a lot. And then also another thing that a lot of people don't consider when considering the value of their works with production and exhibitions costs are the costs associated with showing your art. Gallery commissions, which can vary from place to place anywhere from 20% to 50%. Typically, most places don't take more than 50%, but I have seen it. Exhibition, entry, and acceptance fees if you're doing juried exhibitions or looking into the art fair circuit. Shipping costs and crating fees if you have to pack your work to send it somewhere. Publicity if you need to pay for your own marketing materials. And reception expenses if you're putting on a show yourself. I mean, there's a lot of expenses that go into the cost of producing artwork outside of just sitting down and painting. So it's worth consideration of that too. And then some of the tips and pointers that I came up with is to consider fair market value. Examine other artists working similarly in similar concepts, subject matter, media, size, prestige, and kind of gauge where you sit in that discourse. What are their works selling for? One of the things that I found in that regard, considering fair market value, is that if one person undermines their work, it undermines everyone working similar to them. A lot of people don't think about that. And you see it a lot when you go to those kinds of art and craft show mixes where someone's brought something like really nice toll painting, for example, but they're not selling it for hardly anything because they love what they do, or because they see themselves as a hobbyist. But that undermines everybody working in similar vein, and everyone's works should be valued at more than that, and all of us should have the ability to do something that we love and still make money at it. So if someone wants to know how much your work costs, don't ask them what they think it's worth. Or don't ask them what they want to pay for it. It undermines your authority over your own pricing and over your own art, and that's not something that you want to give away. So you are the expert on your own artwork. remember that, because I've seen that a lot.
What do you say if someone says, will you take less?
That's up to you as to whether you're negotiable or not. You might have a rapport with that person. They might have purchased from you before. They might be purchasing 3 pieces or negotiating more than one. I mean, each person kind of has their own opinion on that. And I think it's up to each individual artist to determine that. But to be consistent with it when you determine that path. So that you're not offering one person something you wouldn't offer to another. Like if you've got someone who wants to negotiate because they're buying 3 paintings instead of 1, then the next person who wants to come in and purchase 3 paintings instead of 1, I mean, unless they just hand you money, I mean, like, be willing to negotiate. I think it behooves us to be consistent more than anything else. Inconsistency also undermines our authority over our own pricing, and then people question the integrity of the value you've placed on your work, and often won't be willing to pay what you're asking, unless you're undermining everybody, in which case, I mean, you can tell because all of a sudden that person doesn't have anything. It's just like, whoosh, it's gone. Everyone recognizes the value of it, and it just disappears. And that kind of leads into the next thing I wanted to talk about in regards to valuing our own work, is honoring your customer base and your returning clients and patrons and those people who do support you. This is something a lot of people kind of struggle with or wonder about, but in regards to their pricing fluctuating over time. But I'm of the opinion that your existing patrons and customers pay good money for the work that they've purchased from you, especially when you have repeat buyers. And it's nice to be able to develop a rapport with them where you can offer them a discount or offer them something else in addition, or whatever rapport you have with them, to be able to show that you appreciate them, invite them to exclusive events, I mean, whatever that you can do. But the people who are buying from you, especially regularly, who are investing in your work, they don't want to turn around and see you offer an equal artwork, like from the same series that they just purchased a piece from, to someone else for less than they paid for it. And, I mean, even if it's not a huge difference, I mean, especially if you're looking at the difference between being in an exhibition with a piece or being in a gallery with a piece and then turning around and selling something out of your studio for less to somebody, that also undermines the gallery representation as well. But in doing this, it undermines your authority and integrity of your value system, and it undermines the value of the purchase as an investment, which means that they might not come back and buy from you again. It also discourages referrals. So, I mean, if someone really enjoyed your work, they're going to be less likely to refer their friends to come and purchase works from you if your pricing is just kind of all over the board and they feel like you're not honoring them. So, in my opinion, if you're going to offer a discount, it benefits you to either do so privately for repeat customers or bartering, like with multiple artworks being purchased, things like that, but to be consistent in it. If someone knows that you're going to have a giant, I don't know, like they know you're going to have a giant eBay sale in 2 weeks, they're not going to buy anything from you now. They're going to wait until the giant eBay sale, so just keep that in mind. And then if you are going to offer some kind of promo or exclusive offer, like a sale or an auction or something like that, make sure to let your patrons know first. And if you can, try to find some exclusive way to tie them in where they actually have an ability to act on it first, if possible, so they kind of get some insider knowledge. And then also in regards to honoring your customers by keeping your pricing consistent, it behooves you to honor any galleries and representation that you have in that regard. Because most of them take a commission, and sometimes artists are tempted, if they're selling something on their own, to just be like, oh, well, the gallery's not taking their cut, I'll sell it to you for less. But if you don't have that rapport with that person anyway, then it doesn't behoove you to do so. Keep your pricing as consistent as possible. And price according to the commission, so that you're not being out that money when someone takes a commission from you. I mean, try to be as consistent as possible with where you think your work is worth, but get what you want out of it. And also, in regards to the gallery representation and honoring your gallery representation, one thing to really consider is that you don't want to negotiate outside of the gallery with their own clientele. They work to build up that group of people, and so you don't want to undermine them by inviting people from the gallery to your studio to check out your artwork and potentially buy things from you and give them a discount, but then not honor the gallery in that business. I mean, if someone is interested and they've contacted you through the gallery and you have a good relationship with the gallery and they're open to it, there's no reason you can't invite them to the studio. But do keep in mind that that's where that contact came from, so honor that representation and still give the gallery some, like work out something with them to give them a commission based on that. Some of my friends who have relationships like that, the gallery won't take as much of a commission if somebody finds them on their own outside of the gallery, but they do take something. So you might be looking at the difference between like someone that's interested in 20% for a finder's fee versus 40% for them actually coming into the gallery, seeing your work and purchasing it from them directly. And that also extends to people that connect with you after you've been in a show, through the show that you've been in. Try to honor those relationships too. If you're underpricing your work, you're not going to be recouping your production and exhibitions costs, which I mentioned before. And it also undermines other artists. So those are things to consider. The other effect of underpricing your work that few people really think about is that potential buyers may devalue what you're offering to them. They think that it's of lesser quality or that it's underpriced for some reason. So you're not actually doing yourself a favor by pricing your works lower. In regards to overpricing, you run the risk of whatever supply that you have, all of the works that you've created, you're going to be stuck with them. You're not going to sell as many as you're producing. So unless you have ample storage space, keep that in mind. Some of the other effects of overpricing is that you can appear overconfident and out of touch with your own abilities, and it limits your audience. A lot of people are turned off by that. Did anyone have any questions? You can also risk losing out on opportunities for overpricing your work because galleries can't understand why your pricing is justified and are hesitant to represent you or take your works on because they don't want to have to insure them or they don't think that they can sell them for that. So it kind of is out of that relationship as well. And that also affects your ability to insure your work. Yes?
What would be an example of an overpriced? Does it depend on the city?
A lot of it is regional. A whole lot of it is regional. I mean, there are people here that their work is priced like really very well according to the local community in regards to what's sustainable for what they're doing at like $4,000, you know, like in the
Not over the end.
Right, you know, like maybe $1,000 to $4,000 for the kind of work they're doing. That if they took it to like San Francisco, for example, they could probably be getting like $10,000 to $15,000 for those exact same paintings. A lot of it's regional. A lot of it's also a matter of what's supported within that region, what the buying population is interested in.
Does it make a difference in medium you use? Do like oil solvent for more than watercolors or stuff like that, or does that?
That's something that you'd have to research in regards to the genre of stuff that you're doing. I'm a conceptual artist by trade, so a lot of my work kind of runs the gamut. I do predominantly plein air events in regards to what I do price my work at, and I have it all standardized by size. Some of it depends on the individual artist. So much is going multimedia now that people are doing so much mixed media where you don't see just one thing, that kind of tips it in so many different directions. As a general rule, though this isn't always true, but as a general rule, paintings that are framed or etched directly tend to be higher valued than works under glass, like prints or watercolors, but it depends on what they are. It really depends on what they are. It depends on how big they are, what the time investment is, the buying audience. I mean, I've seen watercolors that are exquisite, that are worth way more money than oil paintings of similar size would be. It depends a lot on the individual artist as well. So it probably behooves you to look at your genre and kind of figure out where you fit in that. Kind of look at where everyone else is pricing their works and sort of see where you kind of find yourself in that discourse. And that's not something I can help you with directly without like kind of more one-on-one knowing what to do and figuring out where you fit. With the kind of work I do, it's all over the board, and a lot of it's kind of out there. So it's a different fit. I'm not looking at oil paintings versus acrylic paintings versus watercolors. I'm looking at videos versus installations versus plein air. One of the things to consider raising and lowering prices is that it behooves you to be consistent, but every once in a while there is a call to do so. And so you really need to consider why, so that you don't either undermine your clients and people who are already patronizing your work, or wind up exceeding where you can be with how much your work is worth and finding yourself putting it all in storage. So I made a list of when to consider raising and lowering your prices. So I'm just going to kind of read these. If you want to consider raising your prices, a good time to do so is if demand exceeds supply. You just can't keep up with production. You're making works as fast as you can, and they're shooting out the door as fast as you're done with them. At that point, it probably behooves you to consider raising your prices. Another consideration is if your career reaches another level from further training, prestige, representation, influence, or credentials. I went for some very specific training, and now you're one of only 5 painters in the world who know the specific technique. That has a big impact, too, on what you're doing and what the value of your work is. And also with the regional discussion in regards to how much works are worth in one place versus another, that can also have an impact. Another time to consider raising your prices is if your production and exhibition costs go up. The things that you've been using in your work became more expensive or more rare, and you're not recouping how much it costs you to make and show your work, and not gaining as much from it as you want. Another reason to consider raising your prices is that you're kind of coming into your own as an artist, and you're developing a really strong body of work that you want to pursue higher end representation than you've had. And it exhibits a high level of growth and mastering consistency that you feel exceeds what you were doing previously. Maybe more of an internal thing, but kind of a self-development as an artist, to where your current works really kind of hone your skills and talents. In regards to lowering your prices, one consideration is your work just isn't selling. That's a very tricky one, because if it's selling to anyone, it kind of devalues how much they paid for it, so it's kind of a difficult balance. With the economic downturns that so many people have been facing, a lot of artists have been faced with having to lower their prices, but it's been kind of an across-the-board sort of thing. A lot of people have sort of understood the reason for that. Another reason to consider lowering your prices is if your career development has taken some kind of a hit or been put on hold, either due to your own business practices or just because of some other factor in your life where you just can't maintain what you were doing. Maybe there's an illness or something else that has really inhibited you to focus on your work like you'd like. And those kinds of outside circumstances can have a big effect, because if you're not really active, people notice that, and they kind of start to question whether your work has lost value for that reason. And then another one is that you just need to liquidate older pieces that aren't representative of what you're doing currently, but that can be kind of tricky territory, because a lot of people don't really want to invest in a lot of older pieces in that regard. And that kind of brings me into the next theme on this, on pricing your work. Because one good way to liquidate older pieces, but depending on what you want to do, I've seen a lot of people donate them to art auction fundraisers. So it's like all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, I don't want anything to do with this, I'll donate it to this cause and it can go and help them as a benefit. But just kind of think about the ramifications of that. Donation-based auctions can undermine artists' works because they offer them at low starting bids. Some of them never get bid up. And if people know that they can find your work in that context, they're not always likely to purchase from you directly or to find your work outside of it. It can be good publicity for some people because it can be really good exposure, but you have to really weigh the pros and cons of each individual benefit, because some of them are more beneficial than others. Some of them are really good fits for some people with the kind of work that they do, and they know that they're going to build a rapport. Some of them it's just a cause that you really want to support, so you want to be involved somehow. But some of them, they don't do much publicity, they don't really involve the artist in it, people don't appreciate the value of what's given to them, so you kind of have to consider where in that spectrum the art auction fundraiser is.
Is it ever appropriate to say, yes, I'm happy to donate this, but I think it should have a minimum?
Some places will allow you to do that, and I've seen people do that even when it isn't spoken, and sometimes you can engage in some really interesting discourse from the standpoint of encouraging the people doing the fundraiser to really consider the value of what it is that they have.
To at least start the bidding at a certain
Right,
point.
right. I mean, it's well worth asking. I mean, if they say no, then you don't donate the piece and you're not out anything. So, I mean, at that point you know. It really depends on the prestige of what the event is and where you want to be in it. But I would think that it would be. I don't see that as being out of line at all. I remember at one point in time. I'll just read this because it's easier. One of the things that you also need to remember about art auction fundraisers is sometimes they encourage people to undervalue art because people who are looking to collect know that they can get it cheap that way. Not intentionally, I tend to feel bad for the artworks that don't get bid on, but I've built quite a nice collection myself that way. It wasn't intended, it just kind of happened because it's like, oh, that doesn't have a bid. I'll bid on it, and then no one bid against me. But there was actually a reputable executive director at a major St. Louis institution at one point in recent history that when asked how one can start acquiring artworks and build a collection, recommended that art auction fundraisers offer opportunities to purchase works at less than their genuine value, and they're a good way to start. And that just openly undermines the value of all of the artists and their time and their work and their efforts in trying to get their work out there if it's known enough that an executive director would actually consider saying this as a public statement as a means of beginning a collection. So just keep that in mind. Also, when you donate works, in regards to what you can examine for tax purposes for records later, often it's the same as when you're trying to file for insurance if something gets damaged or lost in shipping. You're looking at being able to recoup materials, but you're not looking at being able to show the genuine value of your work. That's very, very challenging. So it's not always easy on tax purposes to be able to say, well, I donated this painting valued at this amount. They might go back and look at it and kind of pick it apart and be like, well, you know, this is what went into it. That's what we consider it to be of value. And so that's worth consideration too. And then the last point that I wanted to make in regards to considering value, and this has come up with some art leagues I've been involved with, is what is an original versus a reproduction. A lot of people don't know the difference. Some of the buying population doesn't know the difference. I've run into art leagues where they're marketing mass-produced clay prints as originals, and I'm like, that's not an original painting. So if you're doing work that is in production as an original, like let's say you're doing photography, then that's different. You kind of fall into that discourse. But if you're making reproductions of your work, then it fall into a different category than the original works they're being reproduced from.
I had somebody ask me the other day, what's the difference between making a photographic print or having a clay done? And my answer to them was the photographic print is first generation to the work, whereas a giclée print is second generation. You don't have to have the giclée print to make the work, but you have to have the photograph to make the photography. Mm-hmm. But it is kind of a gray area because technically they are both a printed piece.
Correct. But if you're working in a media that you can only have printed work, you're in a different discourse.
Right.
I mean, if you're working in printmaking, if you're pulling like hand-pulled prints versus even like, I mean, depending on which techniques you're doing, I mean, at that point in time, you're also in a different discourse. I've got friends who do multiple editions of like handmade books and things that each one is individually made and produced, but they're doing them in multiples. So that's worth consideration too, is how many are in the edition? Is there an edition number, or is it just an open edition of works that anyone can purchase from? Because that has a big impact on value as well. Now, that's, there's too many factors that come into play. There really are. It's an individual, and if you ask anyone, I am not of any kind of like appraisal kind of background, but even if you go to a bunch of different appraisers, unless you've got someone who's known and established at that price point already, if you're talking about just some random drawing by some random person that it's just like, oh, well, how much is this worth? You're going to get answers across the board. I mean, you could ask 20 antique art dealers what their opinion of the value of that piece is, and you're going to come up with 20 different answers unless it's a known piece by someone reputable and their work is always worth blah. You really kind of have to see where you fit within that discourse, where other works that are similar to what you're doing fit, kind of what people are willing to pay for them, and then work to establish your own reputation so that when someone looks at your work, they can just shoot off that number and they know. Where an antique dealer or an art appraiser can look at it and they know what it's valued at. So, I don't know. But I'm not of that area of expertise. And even if I were, I mean, it gets really dicey unless it's something that's already established.
So if you make up a painting, how in the world would you know what is it worth or what can I sell it for?
For me with the plein air works, the way that I started pricing those, because I do it all by size, is even though I'm working outside of the genre, these are my paintings. I brought some as examples of what I do. They're very, very non-traditional plein air paintings, but I do them plein air. I go to events and I market them that way. And
You go where? Go where?
To the events. I've been out to Augusta numerous times, St. Charles, some of the others, mostly local. And then I've been marketing them outside of the events too and showing. I looked at what other people were selling plein air paintings for and kind of figured where I fit within that discourse based on how much time I was spending on them, the fact that they are kind of unusual compared to some of the other things that people are doing. And, I mean, the range even in that is pretty big, where you're looking at one artist selling a piece for like $50 and another artist selling a piece of similar size for $600, but a lot of that has to do with their own pricing systems. But looking within that group of people, I was able to kind of figure out where I envisioned myself fitting. And they've done pretty well for me at the price point I've got them at, so I think I've hit a pretty good price point for where I'm at. But if you're doing something that's just totally out there compared to what everybody else is doing, then it's going to be a whole lot harder to tell. But oftentimes there is some kind of basis for that. So by connecting with other artists working similarly, like let's say you're doing floral still lives, well, look at what other floral still lives are selling for. I mean, look at what other artists are marketing in that way. People that you kind of consider yourself on par with in regards to training and how much they've done and exposure and how active they are in the community and how well established they are and how long they've been doing it. I mean, that's really the only suggestions I can come up with. It's not like trying to sell a car where there's a set blue book value. You can look it up online, figure out kind of where your car sits in that based on if it's been an accident or other factors, but it's easier to determine.
Don't you have to consider where you're selling it?
Oh,
like
yes.
It's always said, fluorescent people don't buy. I hear that all the time.
It's true within a local community. Actually, I've got an entire project traveling throughout the local region about different aspects of the community locally. It becomes even more true when you start looking at it from a national and international standpoint, where you're looking at one city versus another. It varies so much from artist to artist that some artists sell really well within some areas. Like my friend Cindy does really, really well in Soulard, Dogtown. She doesn't tend to sell as much elsewhere. And Dutchtown, she does pretty well there. But when she tries to take her work outside of that environment, she doesn't find the market for it. So, I mean, each little community kind of has its own flavor. I'm sure that there are some things that would sell better in fluorescent than others. But if you find that your things are not those things, don't market them in fluorescent. Take them somewhere else. where they're better appreciated and more likely to find an audience. There's a whole lot of places within town that are well worth exploring, and I actually have an entire list of them that will be available on the website. There's like, probably 20 places on there, all throughout the St. Louis region, that are artist guilds and art organizations like this one, and other venues like that. I didn't even include, there's also a lot of restaurants and coffee shops that if you just want to look for somewhere to put up your work, there's a ton of them, and they're all over, and I didn't put them on that list. That's what I'm doing with my current project. So, moving on, I think the next thing I was going to discuss, this is pretty obvious. I was going to talk about entering jury shows and open calls. I imagine most of you are doing this. Everything I own is basically in a series of Excel spreadsheets, so that anytime I enter something, I can basically note that I've entered it there, and I've got a list of everything that I've entered, everything that's been accepted, what the dates are that it would be gone, because I typically do about, I've often got work in anywhere from 2 to 10 shows in any given month, all over the country, and so I have to track where everything is, where it's going, when it's coming back, so that I don't double book stuff. And I use Excel and Microsoft Word for that, but I mean it sort of depends on what system works for you. It's nice having things in Excel because then you just got them in their own little cells, and you can just copy and paste the cells into the appropriate places, or check the boxes next to them, like is this entered into show. Time frame, things like that, so that you can kind of track where your work is. It behooves you to do that anyway, because otherwise you might drop it off at some consignment store, forget that you have it there, they close, and then you don't know where it is. Had that happen too.
Yeah.
Read the entire prospectus before you start filling out the form, and follow it thoroughly. Make sure that all the guidelines and deadlines are things that you can abide to, and that you're not going to come back later and be like, oh, I can't drop off my work then. Or if it's going to be a problem, talk to the gallery before you enter the form and go through all that hassle. Another thing is to consider the costs regarding your jury shows and things, as to whether or not it's worthwhile, and what you stand to gain from it. Why are you doing it, essentially? And then going back into talking about the Excel spreadsheet where I keep track of where everything is, think about simultaneous submissions. Sometimes people don't consider that. They just kind of write something off like, oh, I'm not going to get into that anyway. I want to enter this piece and this other thing over here. It's okay. They're both in July. Invariably, they'll get into both, and then they've got a missed opportunity because the same piece of work can't be in both shows at once. So try to track where you have things entered or where they are so that you don't find yourself in that circumstance, because it's really... it doesn't reflect well professionally.
So how do you do an Excel spreadsheet?
I've got a spreadsheet and I've got a series of 5 Word documents, each spelling out what's been accepted into which shows where, what I've entered where. I've got my entire resume exists both in a Word document, and then I recently uploaded it all to a blog online so that anyone can go and look at it and cross-reference, well, what women's caucus shows have you been in? But I mean, it sort of depends. I like Word for that because I just like the format of it. But I've developed my own system around that. Personally, I think Excel would be better, but it depends on what you want to track. If you're trying to track too much information and you're trying to put it in these little tiny cells, you're going to have a really hard time with it.
Yes.
And that's why I wound up using Word.
And then not all of us are adept at Excel.
Oh, well, and in that case, find a system you use, whatever you're using to track your checkbook or however you're doing it, if you're doing it on the computer.
Yeah, even if you just have a notebook and a ledger.
Yes.
That's better than nothing.
Yeah, treat it like a checkbook if nothing else. Just treat it like you're balancing your checkbook if you don't have any, because then it's like you're balancing your artwork. Where's my artwork? Where isn't my artwork? Where's it going? So regarding simultaneous submissions, it's good to track everything so you don't find yourself in that circumstance. It's very difficult to avoid if you're seeking a gallery for a solo show. The timeline on that is excruciatingly long, and oftentimes you'll find that because of the turnover when galleries are taking submissions, they all overlap. So let's say you're looking into trying to get a show out someplace in the next year, and everybody's deadline is in April. Well, either you can submit it to one place in the hopes that you're going to get it, and then if you don't, you're kind of out, or you can submit it to more than one place. But different places have different rules and regulations regarding simultaneous submissions, so make sure that you know that up front. If they don't spell it out, you can ask, and you can also tell them what other venues you're seeking for the exhibition. Maybe they'll want to do some kind of partnership with a traveling show or something. You don't know unless you ask. I do a lot of traveling shows. I'll do the same thing in different areas of town because I find that, from my own experience, people don't always travel from Florissant to South County and back. So if you're doing something in one area of town, you're not guaranteed that someone in another area of town is even going to see it. In regards to digital and online submissions for jury shows and entering art fairs and things like that, make sure, go back through 2 or 3 times and definitely look at your works on someone else's computer. Don't just look at them on yours. But make sure that you have the right file type, size, and dots per square inch, so that everything fits within the constraints and parameters according to the entry information. Because if things don't, some galleries will try to work with you, others just throw them away. They don't even look at them, they just go right in the waste can. So if you don't follow instructions, especially regarding that, it's likely that you're not even going to have your works looked at by the juror. It depends on the venue. Some of the online forums, like the ones that I've listed here, if you're entering through the call for entry site or entry thingy, they resize your stuff for you. And sometimes people don't understand when they plug into those forums and they're trying to create a prospectus, they put the wrong information in, and so you try to resize it according to their information, and then the website won't take it because they put in something as a minimum dots per square inch and it was a maximum. So if you run into those kinds of problems, try to look at the entry forum, because it might be that there is a miscommunication between the group and the forum that they're using to take entries. And then make sure to test all your files and your CDs and everything, make sure everything opens properly and looks like you want it to. Ideally using more than one computer. Preferably using more than one computer of different types. Like I have a Macintosh and I like to try to open things up on my husband's laptop. And then I wanted to point out, I've got a list of things here that I'm just going to kind of go through. When is it appropriate to ask questions? If you've got questions regarding a call or a prospectus, most of the time the galleries don't want to be hounded with questions of any sort, so it behooves you not to just keep hounding them and knocking on the door. But if there's any discrepancies in the prospectus, especially regarding dates and deadlines, definitely draw that to people's attention. It might be that it got overlooked, something may have been changed, the group might have been originally planning for one weekend and then changed to another, but it didn't get updated in all of the paperwork. And that's something that they'll want to know anyway, because there's too much confusion surrounding that. They don't want people having to staff someplace twice. But also regarding size and media, things like that, if there's any discrepancies, just draw their attention to it. If you're not sure about your presentation, if they have something about alternative methods of presentation, and let's say you have this wired form that you want to suspend from the ceiling or just hang from the wall and kind of drape down and drape onto the floor, that's probably not outlined in the prospectus. They probably didn't think, oh, someone's going to enter this thing that's going to hang down from the ceiling and drape onto the floor. So it probably behooves you to ask to make sure that it fits within the parameters of the entry specifications before you go through the trouble of entering.
When they ask for the dimensions of your painting, do you just assume they mean framed dimensions?
It varies from place to place. I know that Art St. Louis wants framed. They want the frame. There are other places that just want the image size. Sometimes it also depends, if it's just one specific media.
But if they don't define whether they want, do you call and ask, or you just?
I would call and ask.
It probably behooves you to call and ask. I will admit I don't typically. I just go with the dimensions of the piece. But oftentimes I frame to the edge. I don't have a mat or something. And then if there's a discrepancy or something, I'll try to work with it later. But it does behoove you to call and ask. Often they do want frame dimensions, especially if you've got a mat involved, because they want to know how much wall space it's going to take up. But every once in a while you come across situations where they'd rather know the print dimensions, especially if you're in photography, they want to know the print dimensions. And sometimes I found myself in circumstances where I've listed both, but it depends, because you can write out like print dimensions and then frame dimensions, and then there's no confusion, but that's often more information than anybody wanted. Another thing in regards to asking questions is if you're having difficulty navigating their entry system. Let's say that they've got an online entry forum and you can't figure out how to work with it. I try to ask other artists you know are entering first and see if they're having similar problems. But if you don't know anyone else entering that show and you can't figure out how to navigate it, ask the gallery. They'd rather have your entry than have you not enter out of frustration. And likewise, if you don't understand the instructions, it's sort of the same as navigating the entry system. Like, see if anyone else you know is entering first and what their take on it was. And if not, ask the gallery. And then other things to consider are if you want to include supporting materials beyond what is required, that can actually take you out of jurying in some cases because they don't want them. Sometimes they just don't use them. They just put them aside or throw them out. They won't show them to the jurors. So, I mean, it depends on your circumstance as to whether or not you want to include other supporting materials too. So that it behooves you to ask. And then the other one that comes up for me a lot is I find a lot of resources and entries and places online that I can submit work to, some of which are even free. But some of them, if you're going to be shipping your work, but there's no shipping specifications or requirements, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will not take shipped work. But if it's like a small art league somewhere and they hadn't considered it, that doesn't mean that you can't ship your work to them, but you'll need to work that out before you enter and make sure that you can. I entered, at one point in time, I entered a call for art that looked like an open call for solo proposals for a place in Juneau, Alaska. And it turns out they only wanted Alaska residents. But it wasn't spelled out anywhere, so then they got back to me later about that, and that was easy to resolve, but I hadn't thought to ask, but things like that come up too. As far as shipping your art in regards to entering shows, I mean, this kind of fits in this category because you're going to want to know what carriers the gallery uses and what their shipping protocol is before you enter as well, if you're going to have to ship your work so that you can follow how to get your work there. Other notes that I had on shipping work is considering the cost, both shipping to and from the gallery, establishing accounts with various shippers or finding one that you really like, and then working with them. Most galleries won't take things through the U.S. Post. You have to either ship them UPS or FedEx. Some of them get even more specific where they'll only take UPS or they'll only take FedEx, but often they'll take both. I usually use UPS. And then follow the instructions regarding proper shipping procedures. Sometimes they're not specific, but no one wants styrofoam packing peanuts. That's pretty much guaranteed. And then I've learned on my own behalf that I used to, like, I would have my return labels, and since I had to go and get the return label made when I was shipping the piece, I would just kind of throw it in with the work on top, and I figured, well, they'll see it when they unpack the work. Well, I had one get completely lost at one point in time and had to reprint it and send it back out to them. And since then, what I've done is I've started, like, every time I enter anything, all of the paperwork that I have associated with that show that I'm shipping with my art all goes in a manila envelope, and then that goes in the box. So that you can't miss it. It's all in the same place in the same envelope. And then they can just take the envelope out and keep it with the box, and they know that that's all of the shipping information and artist statements and everything that goes with that piece. Rather than just having it kind of loose in the box in the hope that it doesn't get separated from itself somehow. Because, you know, it could get stuck to the tape on the bubble wrap and then just be gone. And then another thing to consider about shipping 2D work, if you're shipping things that are framed under glass, is that a lot of galleries require that you use acrylic glazing instead of glass when shipping, because the glass is vulnerable in transit. Okay. So that's some of my thoughts on that.
My 2 cents as a gallery owner.
Would have sold twice. Often, sometimes, it takes people a while to come around to something. Like, they have to see it more than once. my stepmother had an ongoing joke about, because she used to do craft fairs and things, and she was like, oh, there's a 3-year mark. You tote the same things around for 3 years and then you sell out. It depends on what it is, but she's like, I've been hauling around these crocheted mice for 3 years, and then the 3rd year I ran out of crocheted mice. And no one bought a single one before then. So it sort of depends on what it is. Sometimes things don't resonate at the time that you do them. They might be ahead of their time, or people just aren't there with you on that. But then, you know, after a few years pass and things change and people evolve and their take on things changes, especially if it's anything political, all of a sudden you might find that people have the same angst as you, and then all of a sudden it sells. It varies. It does behoove you, if you're in a gallery environment and you're changing out works, go change out your works frequently, even if you're just taking the same works back that you had before, because sometimes when you take them down, people are like, oh no, I missed that. And then if you go put it back, it's like the second time they see it, they're like, oh good, it came back, I have an opportunity, I'm going to buy it before, because I missed that, you know, it was like a lost, like they didn't realize how attached they'd grown to it until it wasn't there. Yeah, it makes that big difference. I find that just rearranging the jewelry sometimes makes it sell. Okay, so on to professional presentation. I kind of broke this up into a couple different things. I was talking about two-dimensional wall-hung pieces under glass, though I also kind of talked about others. Make sure that if you have an unframed stretched canvas, like you've done a painting on a canvas, paint the edges of it, even if you just go around it in black. If you're not going to frame it, make it look professional so that it's wall-ready. Don't just sell an unframed stretched canvas with staples hanging out the side. Nobody wants that. It needs to be framed at that point in time. And painting over the staples doesn't make them go away. Wire your work on the back. Even the unframed stretched canvases is often a requirement. Some of the galleries using hanging systems need the wire to be able to work with the hanging system they have in place. And it'll disqualify your work from exhibition if it doesn't work in that system. Otherwise, ask them about alternative presentations if it absolutely has to be on a sawtooth for some reason. I've had pieces that I've had to put sawtooths on because they're imbalanced, and if you put a wire on them, they hang wonky. But if you put a sawtooth on them, they can hang okay. But at that point in time, you have to ask. Make sure that you use braided or plastic-coated wire. And then another thing that is actually coming up in prospectuses now, because too many people have cut themselves, is to take the edges of the wire or otherwise kind of finish them some way, because those can be pointy. And I've gotten plenty of cuts that way myself. If you're shipping work, use acrylic glazing, unless, like, just don't ship glass unless there's some reason that they won't take glazing. You can always reframe it under glass later when you get it back, but the longevity of the work in shipping and transit, it's at risk. And then, this one should be obvious, though I've done artwork about it. If your framing works under glass, make sure there's no fingerprints or tape or hair or anything in them in between the glass and the piece. In regards to framing on the cheap, if your matting works out, even if they're not standard sizes, if you mat things out to standard sizes, you can just go buy standard sized frames. And if you're working on like a whole series of works, you can usually find frames that match. So it tends to help to work in like 4x6 or 5x7, 8x10, 8.5 by 11, frames that you can find. I had a couple of pieces that were standard size frames before, and you can't find them now, like 9x12. Those are becoming rare. And for the canvas boards, they're already cut to standard sizes, but some of those standard sizes are very hard to find frames in, so be aware of that.
Northside Art Association is a nonprofit arts organization focused in Florissant, Missouri, that serves local artists through community exposure, networking, education, and peer interaction.